On Dr. Kiki's Science Hour, we're talking the science of vaccines with Dr. Greg Poland from the Mayo Clinic. Up next on Dr. Kiki's Science Hour.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit. Bandwidth for Dr. Kiki's Science Hour is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Dr. Kiki's Science Hour, episode 38 for Monday, March 22nd, 2010. How to build a better vaccine. Welcome, everyone, to another episode number 38 of Dr. Kiki's Science Hour. And yes, you are here again for one of the only shows around that gives you 1 hour with one expert on one topic. So get ready to dig in because we're going to get dirty. We're talking about vaccines. And vaccines, we've talked about them before on the show. We've brought them up. We've talked about the Wakeland article. We've talked about the autism MMR link. We've talked about a few things, but today we're talking about the science behind developing vaccines. We're going to talk about the H1N1 vaccine and flu vaccines specifically. And these topics have become controversial. So the best way to approach the fear and the emotions that ride along with controversy is to give you knowledge. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to be talking today all about the science of vaccines. And our guest today is Dr. Gregory Poland. Dr. Gregory Poland is the director of the Vaccine Research Group at the Mayo Clinic. And this group conducts NIH-funded research investigating the immunogenetics of vaccine response. And it also conducts clinical studies of novel vaccines and adjuvants in adults and children. Dr. Poland is an interesting one. He calls himself both a warrior and a healer. He is a world-renowned expert at designing vaccines to prevent infectious diseases. And Dr. Poland came to the Mayo Clinic in 1988 because he felt that it was the medical center that fully understood and encouraged his work. And I'd like to welcome you. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Glad to be with you.
So can you tell me a little bit about this warrior healer philosophy? So what about your background brought you to this place?
Well, really two things. One is I was born to a father who was a career Marine Corps officer, and most of the males in my family have been in the military and have served full careers in the military. So that imbues you with a certain way of thinking in terms of an objective and a mission and your responsibility to carry out that mission. At the same time, a healer in that I chose the medical profession for my career, my mission, and I was very influenced by several events that happened when I was a young resident in my 20s. We saw an older man in Minneapolis who fell, scraped his elbow on a concrete step, a pretty minor wound, and very nearly died of tetanus. He survived, although he was left with some permanent neurologic problems or deficits. And then fast forward another year, and I was the senior resident at the hospital, and one of my interns had a newborn son who developed a meningitis with a bacteria called Haemophilus influenza, or Hib. And it was really touch and go. His son did survive, but was left permanently deaf. And it was those sorts of events of seeing people be hospitalized or die or be left with permanent disabilities when they were completely preventable. And this, for me, was really an eye-opener. You know, I sort of grew up in the era of Marcus Welby. I was going to become a doctor and I was going to treat illness. And I do that. But my real joy and my real passion is preventing those illnesses from ever developing. And this has been an incredible profession as a vaccinologist, because so much of sociology and psychology and human behavior weaves into this whole fabric of vaccines and prevention of disease.
Yeah, and how have you seen, as you have moved through your career working with infectious diseases, how have you seen the field change and that discovery, that process of discovery change?
Well, I think a couple of things have impacted it. One is, I was born in the middle of the last century in the 1950s. And, there was just still, for my parents in particular, the barest memory of polio outbreaks and of epidemics of measles, mumps, rubella, hemophilus, chickenpox, all diseases that are completely preventable today.
Right.
So one thing that's changed is that people and parents of young children no longer see these epidemics of infectious diseases, and so they don't take it as seriously as I think our parents did. The other thing that's changed has been technology. We have now the technological ability and the will to develop vaccines to prevent these diseases.
Yeah.
The third thing that has really impacted it, and there's been a lot of good associated with it, is we're an information society. People go to the internet now, and they, without really knowing whether a site is credible or not, often attribute credibility to anything on the internet. And that really has impacted, in many adverse ways, our ability to communicate the value of vaccines, particularly to young people and to parents.
Yeah. And as far as the science goes, have there been leaps and bounds in the technology that allows you to work on vaccines and the research that goes into it? I mean, the 1970s was a time where a lot of fear about vaccines kind of was getting cultivated. So yeah, I mean, it was also kind of the beginning. People were seeing more stuff on television, technologies were starting to build, and is there, since the 70s, has the technology for the science changed also?
Very much so. I mean, the simple paradigm by which most vaccines were developed, I've characterized as an isolate, inactivate, inject. So
Okay.
if we wanted to make a vaccine against a virus, we would isolate the virus, we would heat it usually, or treat it with a chemical to kill or inactivate the virus, and then inject that dead virus, and it would induce immunity.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we still use live viral vaccines. One of the ways in which the technology is changing is through the use of genetics and molecular biology and other techniques such as mass spectrometry. I'll give you one idea. We're trying to develop vaccines against H1N1 and H5N1, which is bird flu.
Right.
And normally what would happen is you'd either give a live virus or you'd give a piece of this virus. What we're doing is using mass spectrometry to identify the little thousands and thousands of pieces that the proteins that compose the virus are broken down into. These little pieces of protein are grabbed on by certain cells called, and certain molecules called HLA, and then held up to the rest of the body for display. We actually now can go in, pull out those little 10, 12, 20 amino acid long pieces of protein, sequence them, and identify them. So for the first time in history, we can see exactly what your immune cells are seeing.
Right.
And if we can do that, we can reverse engineer a vaccine that is just a piece of protein and has no other ill effects associated with it, the way a live virus potentially could.
Right. So instead of having the live virus or even dead virus, you're now it's just bits and pieces of genetic material.
Just protein pieces, correct.
And in terms of the immune system itself, I'm sure that genetics has gone a long way towards our understanding of the complexity of the responses of the immune system.
This is really a very insightful question, Kiki, because here, as an example, both in terms of whether somebody's at risk from a disease, whether they're going to respond to the vaccine, and whether they have a side effect to that vaccine, our laboratory in particular has been spending a lot of effort with the idea that your genetics probably determine that. So we have moved to an era now where we can sequence specific genes or your entire genome and relate that to the probability that you'll make a protective immune response, or potentially in the future whether you're likely to have a side effect to that vaccine. That will be a whole new era of what we have called individualized or personalized vaccinology.
Right. And can you tell us a little bit in the description of the the vaccine research group? There was the word immunogenetics. Can you give us a little description of what that actually is,
Sure.
what it pertains to?
That relates to the idea that specific immune response genes that you carry, and they're different among all of us, influences what sort of immune response, like an antibody response, your body makes. An interesting sideline in this regard is a classic set of those immune responses, or immune response genes, are called HLA genes, or human leukocyte antigen genes. Interestingly enough, the people that we are sexually attracted to and might marry, or from an organism
I was
point of
actually going to ask you about this. So go ahead. Sorry.
It turns out that the person you end up marrying or having a close relationship with, they are almost always carrying a set of HLA genes that are entirely different than your own, which is very unusual. You would think by chance alone, half the time the people we would be attracted to have HLA genes like ours, but that almost never happens. And sort of, if you will, from an evolutionary point of view, that's a good thing, because the offspring of that union then have the most chance of having a variety of immune response genes such that they could respond to infectious diseases. And we see this play out. Let's just take a current example, HIV. There are some people who carry a specific mutation in a gene such that when they get infected or exposed to HIV, they never progress to disease. Other people carry a different sort of gene, and if they get exposed or infected, they are likely to have rapid progression of disease and, if untreated, die. So you can imagine the importance of this, whether it's a natural plague or bioterrorism type event. Your genes determine what sort of immune response you make and whether you're likely to live or die as a result.
Yeah, and there's also the question. There was a study that somebody on Twitter actually let me know about. In Australia, there's a doctor in Melbourne, Australia, who ended up looking at a pregnant woman with swine flu, checking her immunoglobulins and looking to see what was going on there, if there was anything they were missing, because they just couldn't figure out what was going on. And they happened to find, let me see if I can make sure the exact, it was IgG2. It happened to be really, really, really low. So there were low levels of the IgG2 showing up, which I guess is unusual. And the study went on to say that there are probably about 1 in every 5 individuals who have low levels of these naturally. And so maybe there's some kind of link between the IgG2 levels and either vaccine response or infection response.
Absolutely, and that concept that you just explained would be a good definition of immunogenetics, and our group is applying that to the study of vaccines and to the development of new vaccines.
Do you think that do you think there's anything too? I mean, there's probably much more study that needs to go into the specific specific IgG, the IgG2 that they're talking about. But is there? What do you think it is to that? Is it just IgG2? Do you think it's different between different individuals?
Well, it's interesting that it's IgG2, just because that's a fraction that you would of the immune response that you would expect to be elevated during a viral infection, and actually produces or is the type of antibody that would coat a virus and allow that virus to be neutralized or killed. So one could imagine that if you were deficient in that subfraction, you're likely to have more severe disease. So, that's just one of the many leads sort of being followed in this idea or this field of immunogenetics. Then the other idea would be, at some point in the future, if we knew you carried a gene that prevented you from developing an immune response against a pathogen you were likely to encounter, let's say like flu, maybe at some point in the future we could correct that genetic anomaly or treat you with something different to prevent a bad outcome.
Yeah. Do you think there's something, could you be injected with a, say, extra IgG?
We do that now in people who are immunodeficient. We give them human immune globulin. They have to get it on a regular basis. But yes, that would be a possibility. It turned out that this pandemic H1N1 virus that we've just had 2 waves of turned out to be a very lethal virus for pregnant women. And in fact, the military, the Department of Defense, and the NIH are looking or developing a program where they would either come up with antibodies or convalescent serum from other people who had been infected and recovered and now have really high antibody titers of it, and use that as a potential treatment for people who are at severe risk of dying of that infection. Pregnant women might be one group of those individuals.
Yeah, and did they do that research? Is that something that's ongoing?
Interestingly enough, we had a teleconference about this yesterday, and this is ongoing work that the Navy is funding and the NIH.
Well, I'm glad somebody's working on it. That's good.
But, of course, the thing that causes me to gnash my teeth and causes me a lot of anxiousness is that we develop these vaccines in higher and higher technologic ways that are hard to communicate to the public.
Right.
The more high-tech it is and the more science fiction-y that it sounds, the harder it is to communicate to the public, and the more suspicion they have as to the safety of that vaccine, and the more problem we have getting them to take that vaccine. So here is where the intersection of psychology and human behavior dramatically impacts the science and the health of the public.
And also fear about the military funding research projects.
Sure, the military, the government.
I'm sure there are tons of conspiracy theories that'll come out of
Oh, yeah. I mean, we hear these all the time, including some that are really outrageous. I mean, there was a theory floating around that the government was putting something in certain lots of vaccines and somehow funneling these only to members of minority communities to either make them sick or to decrease fertility rates.
Oh, no.
This is crazy thinking. But how do you combat that sort of thinking? An interesting book has been written about this general concept of sort of risk and statistical literacy, and it's called innumeracy. So it turns out that a lot of the public are innumerates. That is, they do not grasp these concepts of risk perception, and estimates, and hence make faulty judgments even about their own health or the health of their family members.
I found I think I found a website here. Innumeracy, a term meant to convey a person's inability to make sense of the numbers that run their lives. Innumeracy was coined by Douglas R. Hofstadter in one of his meta-magical thema columns for Scientific American in the 1980s. And John Allen Paulos has published the book called Innumeracy.
And it's a wonderful book and a real eye-opener in terms of this difficulty people have in estimates and in numbers and in risk. For example, I was just using this with my group this morning, and I said, how long does it take for 1 million seconds to go by? Turns out the answer is 11.5 days. And then I said, now that you know that, how much time does it take for 1 billion seconds to go by? And they couldn't translate that to the idea that it takes about 32 years for 1 billion seconds. And just to have more fun with it, Neanderthals left the Earth about 1 trillion seconds ago, although I'm told some were spotted in Iowa.
Or they may still be, or there may still be some, the Bigfoot sightings might have something to do with that. So it could have been maybe just last week. I don't know.
And so, the way this plays out, and I certainly saw it, I did a lot of media type events around H1N1 vaccine.
Yeah.
You'd hear people, and these are innumerate people, they would say things like, I don't care what the data show, I believe this. Well,
Right.
there's no having any sort of articulate discourse or argument with somebody like that, because if they're going to make judgments on anecdote or emotion, there is no science we know to bring to that, and they will inevitably make faulty decisions.
And I'm just wondering how this might tie into the H1N1 and people deciding whether or not to get the vaccine. Since the vaccine became available, there have been lots of rumors that, or people telling each other that this vaccine hadn't been tested long enough. There's no way it could be safe. There's no way we could know, and there were a lot of websites and news stories basically telling people not to get the vaccine, and other people like the government saying, please do, health officials saying, please do get the vaccine. And then the pandemic kind of, it's pandemic because this virus is global, but at the same time, it didn't end up killing as many people as we were afraid it would. And so everyone kind of is going, the vaccine wasn't any good. It was never a threat anyway.
Just to make a couple of comments about that. So the word pandemic, as you're pointing out, has nothing to do with the word severity. Pandemic just means that the virus will be globally distributed and will cause widespread illness. But it doesn't tell you anything about the severity of that illness. So what researchers in this field like myself or the government or public health authorities are left with is, we know we have a novel virus that's rapidly spreading through the population. The first hint we had of it was in Mexico, where it was killing people. Now you're the decision maker. What do you do? And I think the responsible thing you have to do, and which was done, is to assume the worst and prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. So this was a relatively mild or moderate pandemic. Now, in the U.S., 14,000 Americans who thought this was going to be mild died as a result of that infection. 57 million Americans were ill and lost work or school time. 300,000 Americans became so sick that they had to be in the hospital. So, among people 18 to 55 years old, the death rate against H1N1, or death rate from H1N1, was 5 times higher than it was against normal seasonal viruses. If you were a pregnant woman, an obese person, somebody with chronic medical problems, or certain members of American Indian or First Nation peoples in Canada, you had a very elevated risk of dying of this. This we all know in retrospect. We didn't know this at the time, and so you have to prepare the public for what could be, and you have to provide some sort of therapy or preventive like the vaccine. You mentioned the problem of people thinking it hadn't been tested long enough. This was a really interesting one to me about human behavior. Among the innumerates, you heard things like, well, the vaccine hasn't been tested, it's risky. And that's a ignorant statement because they don't understand what actually happens. Among people who were knowledgeable about that, you heard them screaming, what's taking so long?
Right. Go faster.
What's interesting about it is there are no shortcuts. There is nothing you can do to shortcut the process of making a biologic like influenza vaccine under currently approved guidelines. And so it was tested among thousands of people before it was released to the public. And more importantly, it was merely what we would call a strain change. So the vaccine was made the identical way it's been made for decades, in the identical plants, by the identical manufacturers. What was the risk going to be? We have lots of experience, decades of experience with making an influenza vaccine like this. And in fact, we change all 3 strains in the vaccine every year.
Yeah, it took about the same amount of time. It's about 6 months.
About 6 months, right.
So it took about the same amount of time. And when you test the flu vaccine, seasonal or H1N1, what kind of testing goes in? How do you select people for vaccination or for the test vaccination?
So good question. The first thing that happens is the virus is isolated from a human, and it is grown in chicken eggs. That takes a while to do. Then what happens is ferrets are often injected with it. Ferrets turn out to be very similar to humans in regards to influenza.
And cute.
And we look to see whether ferrets are protected and whether there's protection against these particular strains of influenza. Then what happens is studies are done usually in academic medical centers, like my own medical center here at Mayo Clinic, and we invite people who fit certain criteria. They might have to be a certain age range. They nearly always have to be generally healthy individuals. We would administer the vaccine to them, observe for any side effects anywhere from 7 to 30 days or longer, and measure the antibody response to be sure the vaccine's doing what we think it's doing. And that's simplistically how the vaccine is tested. Again, there's no shortcut to that process.
Right. At any step, if you do shortcut, it runs the risk of endangering millions of lives.
It just wouldn't even be allowed. I mean, it would be a blatantly illegal act to try to shorten it. So it was an ignorant thing for people to say that it's been rushed.
Right. How do you deal with, say, we know that the H1N1 is that pregnant women are highly at risk. Vaccinating a pregnant woman, how can you test for something like that? And the immune response in someone who's pregnant is going to be different from when they're not pregnant. What can you do about those situations?
Yeah, different in some ways, but not so different in other ways. And literally what happened is that for this H1N1 vaccine, there were several studies among pregnant women that were carried out before the vaccine was released to the public. And these, I would call them brave and courageous pregnant women, volunteered to participate in these tests for the good of the public. You can imagine how they felt then when they read in the media people saying things like it's not safe or don't take the vaccine.
Right. Yeah, that it doesn't help at all. But people saying that it's not safe. I mean, at the point where it's being tested, that is still a risk because it's during the testing phase as opposed to post-testing.
Well, so a better thing would be to say we don't know the risks until those tests are done, as opposed to saying it's risky or it's not safe.
Right.
I mean, saying it that way presumes that you have evidence or data that it's not safe, and that, of course, was not the case.
Right. In terms of developing the H1N1 vaccine, the H1N1 is pretty special as far as the flu virus goes. It's swine, avian, human. It's got, from what I know of the flu virus, there are 8 genetic components, and that some of them happen to be bird, and some of them happen to be from swine virus, the swine strain of the virus, and some of them happen to be from a human strain of the flu virus. How does that happen, and how do you create a vaccine that goes along with all of this broad genetic variety?
Well, first of all, I'm amazed that you know that. That's a very sort of esoteric concept that not a lot of people understand, so congratulations. The way it happens is that it turns out that pigs or swine are what we call the mixing vessel for influenza. So just to explain a little closer, all influenza A viruses ultimately have come from birds. Birds have a certain receptor for that virus. Humans have a different receptor for that virus. That, by the way, is one reason H5N1 hasn't been widespread in infection. Most humans don't carry very many of those bird receptors, whereas the pig carries both the bird and the human receptor. So the way it happens is this: these viruses are constantly and rapidly mutating. I mean, it is literally influenza viruses are a cesspool of mutations. And what happens is, by chance, a human or a pig would get simultaneously infected with more than one influenza virus. Those influenza viruses then trade genetic material, and that's how you end up with a virus that has pig, bird, and human elements in it. Occasionally, like in 1918, a bird virus jumped the species barrier directly into humans, and that was a devastating pandemic. You know, public health authorities have learned those lessons. In 1918, somewhere around 50 to 100 people on the earth died as a result of that influenza.
Yeah, that was a massively devastating influenza around, and that's I can imagine. You know, you're looking at it as a researcher working in infectious disease, a healthcare professional, or even someone in government looking at this swine flu that is from the same strain in part, and what's it going to do? What's going to happen?
Right. And you simply have to prepare. You can't wait until you know it's devastating to then start the clock for 6 months to prepare a vaccine.
Yeah. Do you think this is going a little further back, the SARS virus and the SARS scare from just a year or two previously to that prepared us a little bit more for the H1N1? Was the system a little bit better in place?
Absolutely. I think because of SARS and because of H5N1 in particular, that people really were sort of shaken, and I'm talking about governments and public health authorities here now. They really were shaken from complacency. I mean, the last influenza pandemic was in 1968. So here it had been 40-some years, and, you know, people got lax about it. In my lifetime now, there have been 3 influenza pandemics, 57, 68, and now 2009, and in 76, 77, a near pandemic that turned out to not really spread outside of one army base. So very much so, I think that served as a warning alarm to people that we had better get this right.
Yeah, I know personally I've only experienced one pandemic, but in my own life. But I've read books, the Hot Zone. We've got there are all these books talking now about the potential for devastating pandemics, whether it's a hemorrhagic fever, a flu virus, or something that we don't even know about yet.
Very true. I mean, in just my career, spanning getting close to 30 years, over 30 new infectious disease agents have been identified that were never known about. Think about Lyme disease, SARS, H1N1, HIV, Ebola virus. I mean, it's just a long, long list. Yeah. And again, this is where human behavior is so interesting to me intersects as we go into areas of the world that have previously been unpopulated, as we manipulate and change macro and micro environments. We now become susceptible or exposed to viruses that humans have never, or in very small isolated numbers, were ever exposed to. We have no immunity against these viruses.
Yeah, that we have. And purportedly, that had quite an effect on the Indians of the Americas when the Spanish showed up.
Very much so. Measles, influenza, smallpox was a good example. Had devastating effects on the native populations where they had never been exposed to these and had no pre-existing immunity or no herd immunity.
Yeah. Now, thinking about how we're searching for vaccines, infectious diseases are arising. We're searching for vaccines. Is the speed of development? I mean, we're at 6 months for a flu virus. Is the rate at which we can develop a treatment, a vaccine, increasing as we move forward? Because if something shows up suddenly from somewhere that people really haven't been, areas of the world that we don't spend a lot of time in, and suddenly it becomes a pandemic, are we prepared for that?
This is a really, really critical question, and it is a difficult one to answer. So let me it's a bit of a long answer. Let me divide it into a couple of parts.
Okay.
If it's an organism that we already have a vaccine strategy for or pathway for, like a new or unique influenza virus, that we can make relatively quickly because there's an already approved pathway to doing that. But let's take something like SARS or virus X that we don't even know about yet, but happens, including, by the way, a man-made bioengineered virus, let's say, from bioterrorism threat. The only way we would have any sort of vaccine in any sort of time to be helpful would be for somebody to develop the vaccine and the president, under emergency use authorization, to allow administration of that vaccine in the absence of it being a licensed vaccine. So that would have to be a fairly desperate situation.
Yeah.
If we identified a new virus today and we immediately started on working on a vaccine for it, it would be probably 10 years before we would have a licensed vaccine, and it would cost about $1 billion to develop that vaccine and go through the extensive safety and manufacturing testing that is required for a vaccine to be licensed in this country.
Yeah, that gets on another point as well of, is it worth it for the pharmaceutical industries? I mean, is the academic situation such that the academics and research institutions can develop find and develop a vaccine, or if not, are the pharmaceutical industry, are they ready and are they interested with such a having such a huge amount of money they'll have to invest?
Right. So you can imagine, if you're in the U.S., basically all vaccines are manufactured and distributed through the private sector, so private industry. They have to make a profit on those products. They will sink about $1 billion and a decade of effort into making a vaccine, getting it to the point of licensure. And they will have a few years when that intellectual property is still protected by patents in order to recoup their investment. It's a major issue. Now, the other part of this is, for example, there is a way to make influenza vaccines using insect cells. I know it sounds sort of odd, but it works, in a matter of weeks instead of months. But it will, and it has taken years for that process to be certified through the FDA and certified as safe, effective, and reproducible, such that it can be licensed and vaccines distributed. And that often is the bottleneck to all of this, is the regulatory pathway that a vaccine must go through. Now, that's a good thing in many ways. Yeah. Our vaccines are the safest in human history and the safest in the world. But the other side of that coin is it can take a decade for that to happen.
Which is an awfully long time when you have a pandemic that might sweep the globe in less than a year. Yes. So that's a difficulty. Yeah. In terms of going further with the pharmaceutical industry, recently, the pharmaceutical industry, vaccine makers, manufacturers in the United States cannot be sued. I believe they can't be sued for deaths related to or illnesses that are related to the vaccine.
So just a little bit of a correction.
Okay.
So they can be sued for criminal negligence.
Okay.
So in other words, if they tried to take one of these shortcuts that is not allowed, they could be sued for that. If they, if they did something and it resulted in an unsafe vaccine and it could be shown that they knew about it and nonetheless marketed that vaccine, they could be sued. What you're referring to is what's called the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. So every time a manufacturer sells a dose of vaccine, I've forgotten what it is, a few pennies or 25 cents, maybe it's 50 cents, something like that, goes into a pool of money. And that pool of money basically indemnifies the manufacturers. So if you say you had a side effect to a vaccine that had a cost associated with it, in the most severe case, your death, what would happen is that special masters of the vaccine court would award you a fixed dollar amount for that injury. The reason it was done is to avoid the problem of frivolous class action lawsuits that were driving vaccine manufacturers out of the U.S.
Right, and so they'll still stay here and will keep making vaccines.
Right. So we got to the point where we were down to a couple influenza vaccine manufacturers and one group making tetanus diphtheria vaccine. So it was a desperate situation for a while there.
Yeah, I'm wondering, there was an article I read in the Scientist magazine talking about this. And you mentioned a little earlier individual genetics-based vaccines or immunization. And with this kind of protection for the vaccine manufacturing industry, do you think there's going to be a huge boom in vaccine research, vaccine creation, manufacturing that's going to, increase the number of more specialized vaccines that'll be out there for people?
Yeah, I think we will have, and sort of the word that's been used is niche vaccines. Mm-hmm. I think we will start to have a variety of niche vaccines, and I think even the definition of what we call a vaccine is going to change. Right now, all the vaccines that we have are preventive vaccines against infectious diseases. What we're moving toward is that we may well have therapeutic vaccines, that is, vaccines that would work to treat a disease rather than prevent a disease. And we're developing vaccines against non-infectious disease agents, certain types of cancer, diabetes, atherosclerosis, dental caries, a whole variety of things that you might not consider sort of classical infectious diseases. So in our lifetimes, I think we're going to see a major expansion in vaccine research and development of different kinds of vaccines that will have even more impact on the health of the population.
There's the worry, though, that if more and more vaccines are being created, these therapeutic and for infectious disease vaccines, and the inability to sue the vaccine manufacturers, do you think that there will be the potential for the growth of, that whether or not they'll start cutting corners, or whether there might be problems associated with that?
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. And of course, sort of wisdom here would reside in a healthy tension between some level of risk for the manufacturers and culpability, a focus on the regulatory pathways for safety, and impact on public health. I don't know if we're quite there yet, but I think we're closer to it than we have been in the past. I guess we've certainly seen in the media in other areas of commerce that manufacturers are willing to take shortcuts or do things when profit motive exceeds the safety and health of the population. I can tell you, I have not seen that in 30 years among vaccine manufacturers. And I think part of it is there is a different sense. It's one thing to take a drug that has risk when you're sick. It's another thing to say, I'm going to inject something into you, you're perfectly healthy, to prevent the possibility of something happening to you in the future. Yeah. And so appropriately, the Center for Biologics at FDA has set very stringent high thresholds for safety. Now, part of the problem is you can't, until you use a vaccine widely, you don't know all of the risks. But if you don't use it widely, you'll never know the risks. And if it's a good vaccine, you won't be protected. So there's always this tension in there. And no matter how widely you use it, there is no such thing as perfect safety. It does not occur, it cannot occur, and it doesn't occur in any dimension of our life.
Yeah, there's absolutely, I can't imagine any, more people die in the bathroom than anywhere else, slipping in the shower, whatever.
Yeah.
You can't keep it perfectly safe.
Your chances of dying due to choking to death is 1 in 68,000. Well, vaccines are safer than that.
Right. What are how safe are vaccines now in terms of percentages of risk?
So let's say that it's the first time you're ever getting vaccines.
Yeah.
There might be about a 1 in 100,000 to 1 in a million chance of you having an allergic reaction to that vaccine.
Right.
I'm excluding the risks that could occur if you got a vaccine when you shouldn't. For example, if you were highly immunocompromised, let's say you had a cancer and you were getting chemotherapy and somebody wrongly gave you a live virus vaccine, that's a different risk. And that risk would be potentially high, but it's not a risk we calculate because we never study it, because you wouldn't do that. Okay.
Why get a vaccine when you're already sick and there's something wrong?
Yeah. So in terms of risk, where, in otherwise healthy people, another risk that has sort of been nailed down is the risk of a neurologic disease called Guillain-Barre Syndrome. This is a paralysis that occurs. And this came up with H1N1 because it was a problem with the 76-77 H1N1 vaccine. So what researchers did is they looked in 1992-93, when about 80 million doses of flu vaccine were given. They could not find any risk of Guillain-Barre. Then they looked in 93-94, again another 80 million doses, 90 million doses given, they couldn't find a risk. So they artificially combined both years. Now you have a pool of almost 280 to 200 million people who got the vaccine, and they could not exclude a risk that would be as high as 1 in a million. So let's just accept that as a risk. If you got a flu vaccine, the theoretical risk of developing Guillain-Barre is 1 in a million. 1 in 8,000 Americans dies each year due to influenza. Which risk are you going to take? The innumerates don't know how to balance that risk. And they emotionally hear, wait, I could get a vaccine and have a 1 in a million chance of a severe side effect. That's not safe. I won't take it. While rejecting the 1 in 8,000 risk that's going to occur to them if they don't take the vaccine.
Yeah, well, I guess I can understand from the emotional side of it that the risk, if there's any risk, something could happen. That's all. That's all you hear, and so you can respond. You would respond to that and say,
right.
That sounds dangerous. There's a risk. The word risk. The word risk itself creates an emotional response that people are going to come back with.
But if you're wise, you have to move beyond the emotional response to say, well, wait, what are all sides of the data so I can pick a better option? As an example, virtually all of our listeners today got into an automobile and drove somewhere, knowing that there's about a 15 or 20% lifetime risk that they're going to have an accident and have a permanent disability or death as a result of that. 15%. And yet they accept that risk because they perceive the benefit to be greater. So without knowing it, they have made that risk-benefit calculation. The same is true with vaccines and infectious diseases.
Yeah.
And there's just no way around it.
Yeah. Can you speak to the risk? There's some talk about the number of vaccines that we're currently giving children, I believe, and the risk of complications from having all of those vaccines, or even having them all at once as opposed to spread out. So
this is a great question. So when I was born in 1955. My mother, and I hope she's listening, there were 4 vaccines to be given. Now, for children born today, there are 16 vaccines and some 38 doses that they have to receive. So I do have empathy from the point of view of administration of those vaccines. A mom or father comes in with their 1-year-old baby, they might get 3, 4, 5 injections. Who wants to get 5 injections? And yet, it is a safe thing to do. It's an uncomfortable thing to do, but it is a safe thing to do. This idea that we could somehow overload the immune system is a fallacy. There is no theoretical limit to antigens that we get. So let's just say you got 5 vaccines, okay, 5 antigens. By contrast, when you get strep throat, your body sees 250 antigens. If you were to get actually infected with influenza, instead of the influenza vaccine that we give to prevent it, your body is seeing thousands of antigens, as opposed to the 2 antigens that we would give in a vaccine. So again, I think it's when people say that, and it sounds like a lot, I got to get 4 or 5 vaccines at once, I think it's more a matter of education. They don't understand this concept of antigen or antigenic overload.
Yeah, I think that's something that needs to be taken into consideration. But people just can't get it. It's just the number. They think of it as this large insult to the immune system, and that there is some limit, and that somehow they've gotten that into their heads. And
and it's an incorrect concept. And I guess the other side of that coin is it's a responsibility of the doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and others who educate the public and public health authorities that have to educate the public about this.
Yeah. So we're coming. What was that? What was that you're going to say?
I was going to say, absent that, people fall into patterns of thinking that lead them to wrong conclusions.
All the time.
All the time.
Yes, like my wrong conclusion of drinking a bottle of wine. No. Only 1 glass. Just 1 glass. No.
Yeah, 1 glass of red wine is healthy for you. Doesn't mean the whole bottle is healthy.
Doesn't mean the whole bottle is healthy. We're coming to the end of the show, and I was just wondering if there's a take-home message, or if there's anything that you want to leave our listeners with in terms of the science of vaccines and the work that you do.
The thing that I really would like to say to our listeners is these infectious diseases can be devastating. I see them happen all the time. People think it won't happen to them, but I can assure you it happens every single day of my medical practice. I see these things. So I would really encourage you, go to a credible source of vaccine information. When you go to the doctor, ask what sorts of vaccines you should have, what sorts of diseases you're at risk for. And then do the intelligent thing. Ask questions, get your questions answered, demand that your questions be answered about what vaccines I should get and what safety data there are. But eventually, you have to follow expert advice or create your own advice and act on that. But I think to just sort of bury one's head in the sand and not pay attention to this is to greatly risk your health and the quality of your health. I'll give you one example. For people over the age of 65, shingles happens in about 20 to 30% of them, and half of them are left with chronic pain, again preventable with a vaccine, but many of them don't know about this vaccine or are afraid because it's a live virus vaccine. Similar story with what we saw with H1N1 this past year. So be informed.
I think that's a wonderful place to leave it. And here is a website that you had suggested. One website, the National Foundation for Infectious Diseases. That's www.nfid.org. And there's information about infectious diseases research that's going on. Also, the National Network for Immunization Information. That's www.nnii.org. And here's there's a lot of information, great information to educate yourself about vaccines and the diseases that they prevent, the research that's going on, the issues. And if you have more questions about the flu, the CDC is a great source of information. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have a website specifically for the flu. That's www.cdc.gov/flu.
And then, Kiki, I was telling you, you got to have a little bit of sense of humor. And I said I was going to show one poster here.
That's right. You said you were going to show. Hold it up
there
higher.
It is.
Hi, Mom.
Hey, the sports figures get away with it.
I love it. I love it. It's good to say hi to your mom every once in a while,
That's
especially
right, yeah.
especially when you have a good media opportunity too.
Hey, there's my last piece of advice. If you haven't called your mother, call your mother.
I think that's some great advice. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today, Dr. Poland. It has been wonderful talking
Really
with you.
enjoyed it.
Yeah, I have as well. It's been really great. And I'm Dr. Kiki, and this has been Dr. Kiki's Science Hour. And what was I going to tell you? Oh, next week we are going to talk about language and the Amazonian jungle. We're talking with Dr. Daniel Everett, who is a linguist, and he's been studying a tribal people down in the Amazon jungle on the Amazon River and gotten some really interesting ideas that kind of throw our understanding of language and cognition for a loop. So it'll be really interesting to talk with him. And if you're interested, there's a book out. It's called Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes. It's his book. And the Twist This Week in Science book club is actually reading it right now. So we're bringing things together. Don't sleep, there are snakes. You must keep your eyes out. My name on Twitter, you can catch me on Twitter at Dr. Kiki. That's DRKIKI. You can email me at drkiki@twit.tv. You can download the podcast, find the podcast at twit.tv/Kiki. And I guess that's all for the show. If you need any more sciencey goodness, you're going to have to tune in again next week. Again, I'm Dr. Kiki. Peace out.